think the first thing to say is that there's no single area in the brain for music. And we know this because we can have a look at patients who have suffered musical impairments following stroke, for instance. And what we see is remarkably different presentations depending on where the stroke has damaged the brain. Okay, so you may find a patient who has lost the ability to perceive timbre in music. So this means like they cannot distinguish between the sound of a flute and the sound of a trumpet, for instance. But in all other aspects, their musical perception might be fine. They can still perceive and recognise familiar melodies, etc. But they might have this specific difficulty. On the other hand, you might have people who've got problems with rhythm but not pitch, or vice versa. So we know we can have a look at how musical perception breaks down in these cases of brain damage, mostly following stroke, and we can see that the picture is rather complex, and that music is essentially a symphony of different components all coming together at once. And these different aspects of musical perception are dealt with by different aspects of the brain, okay? And that's only even thinking about the perception of music, so the perception of timbre, of pitch, of rhythm, of harmony. All of these aspects of musical perception rely on rather distinct parts of the brain, yeah? Then we can think about the emotional effects of listening to music. And we know that these areas involved in this emotional experience of music are again different from the areas involved in the perception of music. So in a very nice study by some Canadian researchers, Blood and Zatorre, they asked what was going on in the brains of people who were having musical shivers down the spine. Yeah, so this experience of having a physiological sort of transformation when you hear it's normally a particular passage in a particular piece, and it's very idiosyncratic. So the piece that causes a shiver down my spine will be different from the piece that triggers a similar thing for you. And these researchers made use of this in a very clever way, because they looked at the brain's response when people were experiencing their shiver down the spine, and they know because people could, I think, report after the scanning part, or perhaps they could press a button to say when they were having this. And they compared the brain's activation in these situations versus when people were listening to a piece of music that didn't elicit the shiver down the spine. But the very clever part of the experiment was that one person's trigger was another person's control music. Yeah? So this meant that all of the pieces were present in both the experimental shivers condition and also the control condition. But by sort of looking at which participants were experiencing the shiver, they could quite neatly compare what is the brain doing in this situation versus when it's not experiencing this shiver. And what they found was that really this experience seems to hijack the brain's general pleasure-related circuitry, so areas like the amygdala and the insula and the thalamus, which are areas that we know to be very responsive to other biologically adaptive rewards, like eating and sexual behaviour as well. So this is really like the sex, drugs and rock and roll circuitry of the brain, if you like. And so we know that, but even unpicking the brain's response to musical pleasure and reward is quite a complicated story, because there's aspects of the brain that are involved when we are we're anticipating something happening in the music. And then there's other parts of the brain that are involved when we actually when the rewarding aspect of the music is delivered, if you like. So there's kind of cycles of activity with different brain areas being involved in the different stages of anticipation and reward. So this is in fact one of the theories regarding why we like to listen to music is to do with the rewarding aspects of the musical listening experience. And actually music offers an opportunity to anticipate what will come next. So we know that the brain is, if you like, a machine. It's a very good prediction machine. So essentially our brains must make predictions about events that are going to happen in the world, because by being able to predict what's going to happen next, we can prepare for it, and that's an important part of, evolutionary fitness. Really, being able to, prepare and adapt to things that are going to happen to us. But we can. So, for instance, why do we derive such pleasure from music? Is this quite a useless stimulus in a way? It's not really anything to do with survival. But an interesting theory suggests that actually, because of the complexity and the structure involved in music, there are ample opportunities for our brain's prediction machinery to get to work, if you like. So it's a bit like having a massive cerebral workout when we listen to music, because we can always work out, where is the music going to go? Am I surprised by what's happened in the music? So there's many different levels on which we can form anticipations about what's going to happen next. And of course, we're not doing this for any survival purpose, but the argument goes that because we are by nature prediction, a species that likes to make predictions, that we can't help but do this. And actually music is a super stimulus for allowing us to make predictions. And of course, when we're accurate in our predictions, that can be rewarding. And that's essentially perhaps a part of why we like to listen to music. Well, there's many questions about the effects of music on the brain. I suppose, so currently I'm quite interested in the role of music to modulate mood, and how that can be an effective tool for, for mental health conditions, or for motivating people to do rehabilitation after stroke, for instance. So I'm picking the relationship between music, motivation and movement, for instance, is an important area for me. In my past research, I've also been interested to think about how people who had perceptual difficulties with music, so people who have this thing called congenital amusia, can nevertheless, in some cases, still appreciate music. So that's quite an interesting observation, because you might think that in order to be able to appreciate music and have an emotional response to it, you would think that that would only happen if you were able to perceive and encode music the way it was intended, as the composer wrote it, for instance. And if there are people who essentially can't tell one tune from another, or seem to have difficulties, at least on the standardized tests that we've been using, seem to reveal quite striking perceptual difficulties with music, it would be logical to think, I'm sure these people are not able to get very much out of music. It probably just sounds like noise to them. But in fact, what we found when we asked people about their uses of music in everyday life, as well as the psychological reasons for which they used music, what we found was that there was at least a third of our sample of participants with congenital amusia who used music in everyday life just as much as the people without amusia, and also psychological, and also for similar psychological functions as well. So it's telling us that within that group of people who do have genuine perceptual difficulties, there are some people who can somehow nevertheless get something from the music listening experience. And that's an interesting observation, I think, because it shows you that perception and appreciation can dissociate. They're not necessarily always intimately linked.